Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ian Proud. I am the peacemonger. It is Wednesday afternoon, the 4th of February. I'm delighted to welcome back today Commodore retired Steve Jermy, formerly of the Royal Navy, who's an expert commentator on anything kind of political military and has been sort of visible on a whole range of podcasts, including Danny Davis Deep Dives and many others. Steve, welcome back.
Yeah, good to be back, Ian. We arrived back at interesting times, not only in Russia, but also as we watched Iran. So very good to be back.
Yeah, the Iran situation is interesting right now, isn't it? I mean, let's maybe, I hadn't planned to, but let's perhaps kick off with that. I mean, everybody's kind of waiting for the Americans to go in. I mean, what do you think is their game plan, with Iran? I mean, obviously gunboat diplomacy is one, but I mean, do you think they actually have a plan, a military plan,
Um,
if the Iranians don't back down?
I think it's an open question, Ian, but what I've said in a more recent podcasts, I think with Daniel Davis, is that there isn't sufficient force in there to run an extended operation. It sounds like a lot with one carrier, and they're big carriers with a huge amounts of power. But for the Gulf War, the second Gulf War, we had there were two British carriers in the Red Sea for landing operations, but there were six American strike carriers. And you need that sort of level of force to run an extended military operation, even a sustained bombing campaign against somewhere like Iran. So I think I wouldn't say it's tokenism, that's too weak, but it is something where they will be able to do a demonstration. But the key thing is that some of the key places that they would wanting to use air power against are significant different distances inland from the sea. So I think you've got about, if your carrier is stationed 200 miles offshore to give you the warning time against Iranian responses, your jets are going to be 200 miles before they become feet dry, which is then go over Iranian land. And then they've got another sort of 500, 600, 700 miles to fly to actually get to the locations which they might want to attack. So that sounds like a very unpleasant strike package to be part of, I'd say, because you're up against significant Iranian air defenses. So I'd be surprised actually if that's something that the carrier strike group will want to do. To do that, you'd really want to be using American US Air Force jets from other places. And the question is, where will those places be? The Gulf states have said they're reluctant or no. And so I think you're left with really Israel and probably Jordan. And again, those two would be, the airfields there will be vulnerable to counterattack from Iranian bombardment. I have a sense that this is really about posturing, and that actually what it's really about is about posturing, and so that at some stage it'll come into negotiations, and then negotiations will take us perhaps back to where we were before Trump cancelled matters with the nuclear control arrangements in his first term. So I suspect that we'll come back to diplomacy. Mind you, it's 50-50, and you never know with this White House quite where they want to take it. So watch this space, Ian.
I mean, surely even if they use Jordan or Israel, they'd still need to cross over Iraq to get to Iran, right? And there's no guarantee that the Iraqis will let them fly over either, I assume.
No, I think they'd probably assume that actually that the Iraqis would not authorize use of their airspace, but they'd use it anyway. Risky thing to do, but that's what would be my guess. But again, if you haven't got these places, then where do you fly from? Because you're always confronted with having to go through somebody's airspace who doesn't want you there in the first place. That is the advantage of the carriers. But the carrier is stationed at least, I would have thought, 200 miles off the coast of Iran, with another 500, 700, 800 miles to get to Tehran. So, it gives you a sense of the challenge that you face if you want to do something significant with air power. The other thing that I feel as well is you've probably got enough defensive kit in the carriers, air defense missiles and those sorts of things for run probably about 6 days. But after that, you're going to have to be withdrawing. So my guess is that advice will have been passed into the military strategy and sort of calculations. And my guess is that what we're talking about is a demonstration of force at the most, after which, no doubt, the White House would hope that it can declare victory, even if it is actually negotiation, which takes us back to the 2016-17 stages, and then come out with another win, which in truth isn't. Takes us back sort of 6 years to where we were in the first Trump administration.
Yeah, well, I mean, Trump was the one who basically collapsed the JCPOA in the first place, right? So, does he want so a Trumpified version of some sort of JCPOA strengthened deal, do you think?
I would. That's where I would be going. The reason I'd be going would be guessing in that direction here is that I think there are the unintended consequences of the attack are much worse than people think. Firstly, there is the possibility of American air bases within the region, American army bases being attacked. And again, these attacks, they're very difficult to defend against some of the missiles which will be used. The second is even more significant, which is that Israel will find it extremely difficult to defend against a prolonged Iranian bombardment. Israel's a very small country, whereas Iran is a big one. I thought it was about 20 to 1, but one of my commentators reminded me recently that it's about 80 to 1. So Iran is 80 times the size of Israel, because the inverse of that is Israel is very small. And so you don't have a big target to aim at, which means you can't miss. And so a sustained bombardment into a very small area can do significant damage. And I am about as sure as I can be. That's the reason the 12-day war stopped so quickly, because the Israelis were suffering very significant damage, which was actually knocking out their economy as well as other military facilities. So that's why I'm sure that finished. And the third thing, which is even more significant for the whole world, of course, is the Straits of Hormuz, which are straightforward to actually shut off. And there are very, very large amounts of, everybody knows, oil and gas coming out through the strait. So that would have a huge impact on the global economy. Who knows where that might take a global economy, which already looks very fragile. So I think for these reasons, I'd be surprised if the White House haven't done the analysis, and I would be surprised if they really are prepared to accept a significant damage, overwhelming damage, I would say, to Israel. Because I very much doubt that the Iranians would take their foot off the throat this time around in the 12-day war, but this time I think they'll really go for it. So let's see where we go to. My guess is that we will end up in diplomacy, and I hope I'm right.
Yeah, I mean, the other option is regime change, right? There's been a recent attempt to actually install modern day Shah in Iran. It's not clear that the people have fully given up on that effort as yet. I mean, do you think one of the kind of subtexts to this is to kind of foment further unrest after the kind of recent brutal crackdown by the Iranians?
I think actually the timing is all wrong now, and I suspect that actually people didn't think it's true, because there is a lot of evidence. And if you listen to people like Alistair Crook, he and others will say that a lot of the instability in Iran was as a result of Mossad and CIA agents seeking to actually generate just that instability. And it would have been even worse had they not shut down the Starlink, which in turn allowed the Iranian regime to actually restabilize the country. I think had the Americans been in position to actually provide military force at that stage, then in an integrated way, then it might have been different. But to me, these two are separated. And because of that separation, I think it makes any chance of the using military power to actually get those demonstrations up and running. Because there is evidence that a lot of demonstrators were actually against the activities which the more radical people were taking against the regime. So my sense is that the opportunity is lost. My guess is that the Israelis will no doubt know that as well. I mean, there's talk of Mossad agents being rounded up and so on. So who knows? But I think that opportunity is gone.
Yeah, of course, the other missing element is ground forces too. I mean, I'm old enough to remember both the Iraq Wars, the Gulf War, and then the Iraq War in 2003, when there was a significant and over a period of months ground force build-up actually in Saudi Arabia. Of course, that's not available now, and in any case, it's in the wrong place. I mean, the Americans don't have that opportunity available to them, so everything is entirely sea-based, right, when it comes to military intervention.
Yeah, I mean it is gun and airboat, gunboat and aircraft diplomacy really, and that's why I think it's unlikely to work because this time round it's against a country which won't be surprised a second time or a third time round and is ready. So I think that any attack will there must be people must be doing the calculations that they will lose American aircraft and American aircrew, which won't play well politically. And you don't get any sense in continental USA of appetite amongst the MAGA and others for a war in the Gulf. And I think that for those and other reasons, I think that the chance of the Americans putting boots on the ground are about zero. Because even if they to do put boots on the ground and achieve regime change, you are talking at least 500,000 troops. And that's the sort of figure that was in the first Iraq War. And
Yep.
there's no appetite for that. I mean, the American army at the moment is about 470,000. And of course, only half of those I would have thought would be deployable, perhaps two-thirds. But that takes time. It takes 6 months or so to actually get that to full deployment with its logistics. Whichever allies may come on, so that the chance of doing a land intervention, even if there were the appetite for it, and there's none, it would be 6 months before something like that could be done. It took 6 to 9 months to actually get the second Iraq War forces all
Mm.
in. So no, I think land intervention, which is the only way where you guarantee regime change or have a good chance of achieving regime change, it's a non-starter.
Yeah. And just as a brief aside, and pushing back on Trump's comments about the British forces not playing their role, I think we made up almost about 30% of the land troops involved in the second Iraq War, or at least 25% anyway. I was looking through the numbers kind of fairly recently, but that's just a bit of an aside. But
Yeah, yeah, it was
go
a
ahead.
significant amount. We deployed an army division, which is a significant force. So I don't can't remember if it's 3 or 4 brigades. So it's a significant force with all the support and with a lot of air power as well. So it was a significant force. I mean, the overwhelming majority was from the Americans, but there were other countries involved as well. But I would guess that 25% feels a little bit high for me, but it might be 20%. So a significant force. To
Yeah,
go with the Americans.
and a force that we wouldn't be able to deploy today of that density.
Yeah, yeah, not least of all because, of course, a lot of the weapons and a lot of the ammunitions and stockpiles have been used up in support of the Russia-Ukraine war. So I think we would struggle. The chances of us deploying a division, I would guess that we might be able to do it in sort of 6 to 9 months at the earliest, and I think more likely 9 months to a year with a lot of industrialization in this country to start to produce the sorts of levels of combat power we need. I mean, I don't know how many British serviceable tanks there are in the country, but there are some quite horrifying stories of what we do have to deploy. Some of those have already been sent out to Ukraine, challenges out to Ukraine. So I think that again, this is something which, if it were politically possible, would theoretically probably take about sort of 2 years to be in a position to deploy something like that. So I think it's a non-starter.
Yeah, no, I agree. Mark Russell was in Kiev yesterday, talking about and complaining about the sort of attacks on civilian infrastructure, cutting off of heating. But I mean, the best answer to that is to end the war, right? And there's no sign really that people like the sort of NATO secretary are substantively committed to what Trump is trying to do.
Yeah, I haven't heard Mark Rutte's statements, but again, I'm not surprised. I also heard, I think Zelensky say that this is terrorism. It's not. It's warfare, and that's what it is. It is a classic thing in war to actually reduce your enemy's logistics capacity. And of course, logistics capacity is a function of energy and industrial capacity. So, surprise, surprise, the Russians are now attacking more than in the past. They're attacking the energy infrastructure and the industrial capacity. Uh, the logic is militarily clear. We did exactly the same thing in the Second World War. We attacked ball bearing factories and things like that using the United States Air Force and the Royal Air Force. So this isn't unusual, but we would have done the same things elsewhere. I think what's interesting is that the level of civilian casualties is astonishingly small compared to those which we, for example, inflicted in the Second World War, or more recently in our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the Russians have been much, much more precise in this way. I suspect that's because of clear political direction. I don't know. But although people talk about 3 or 4 civilians per attack, which is a it's a tragedy for the civilians involved. In terms of collateral damage, those numbers are very, very small, and people I think need to see them for what they are, which is Russia increasing its military attacks on logistics infrastructure to support its land operations elsewhere. It doesn't surprise me at all. Speaking as an energy person as well, I've heard 1 or 2 people say that the infrastructure can be restored quickly. I'll be astonished if it can be restored so that we've got back to significant electrical power in Ukraine within 2 years. It wouldn't surprise me if it's 5 years, that sort of figure. But energy infrastructure takes a long time to actually develop or redevelop.
Yeah, I mean the other challenge that Ukraine faces are kind of the Soviet style sort of communal heating systems, which I think have taken a lot of damage this year, particularly with the winter being so cold. But the latest article in the Financial Times came out yesterday suggesting that we're nudging closer towards some sort of security guarantee. Zelensky says that he's 100% happy with them. What the Financial Times was reporting, at least, was some sort of trigger type mechanism where if Russia were after a future armistice, if it ever happens in Ukraine, there would be a scalable response. So no kind of immediate deterrence force, but within 24 hours after a Russian attack, there would be the potential for this so-called coalition of the willing, so French and British, but also apparently Icelandic, Turkish, and Dutch, I believe, troops going in quickly to support the Ukrainians. Then within 72 hours, potentially the scope for US intervention. I mean, if you'd have drawn on a blank piece of paper, you could perhaps see why people might think that was something sort of having boots on the ground, for a ceasefire. But I mean, what's your sense anyway?
I've always thought the best security guarantee for Ukraine were offered in Istanbul in March, April of 2022, which was neutrality. And I think that's the best way for the Ukrainians to guarantee their security, because of course Russia will be part of that. I think that these discussions I watch with a sense of bemusement, because they're discussions between the Ukrainians, the Americans, and the Europeans, with no discussions on security guarantees with the Russians. And so essentially, they may have agreed on this package, but frankly, until the Russians have agreed to it, they're meaningless. I also think that when you think about a security guarantee, it's essentially having a response to something which requires significant military firepower. And there isn't that significant military firepower in Europe. We know that. The Americans keep telling us that we're not spending enough. And it's clear from the size of our armed forces. And so I think the sorts of thing that I've heard as you've described is fairly meaningless. And it's certainly meaningless until the Russians have agreed to it. The Russians have been absolutely clear about no NATO in Ukraine. And I would have thought that for the Russians, even the idea of NATO being part of the fire brigade for Ukraine, albeit it's a fairly weak fire brigade, I would think the Russians will say no out of hand. So it's a theoretical conversation happening on one side of the debate, and I'd be extremely surprised if it ever comes to anything meaningful. I think that the any meaningful discussions have to include the Russians. So watching these, not only these discussions, but the ones that we've had in the past. I think there have been two conferences, peace conferences in Ukraine without Russia. I mean, what are people thinking? It's almost childlike thinking. It seems to me that we can have a bunch of something which masquerades as diplomacy with the what appears to be the winners of the conflict excluded from the discussions. It must be the first time in the world where the losers of the conflict are thinking that they can set the conditions of the ceasefire, although I prefer to use the word the sort of enduring peace. But let's see. My guess is that it will come to nothing, and that the substantive discussions will be those which happen with the Russians in the room, and that until those subsessions happen, and even during the discussions, that the Russian military machine will keep moving forward to achieve the military objectives, which I suspect are clear in their minds, albeit unclear to most Europeans and Americans, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, those trilateral talks have started again apparently today in Abu Dhabi with the Americans, the Russians and the Ukrainians. So let's see kind of how far they get about. But I mean, this whole trigger response, the kind of weak fire brigade, as you uh, describe it, it actually doesn't really cover the actual ceasefire monitoring itself in terms of who judges when there's been a breach. Um, and there, I think. Russia would want, and I think it would make sense to have some sort of non-NATO involvement, including, I don't know, China, India. I mean, India is by far the biggest peacekeeping provider in the world with other South Asian. I mean, I think Pakistan provides a lot as well. Bangladesh does too. But I mean, they have a lot of expertise here. I mean, there's a bigger question about whether UN peacekeeping is effective, of course. But ceasefire monitoring surely has to have some sort of non-NATO component to it.
But yeah, I think actually I would go even further and say that it needs to have no NATO component to it. So I think you're exactly right. I would be interested to see who would be willing to stand up to the plate, and how they'll be paid for it. But I do think if there's going to be a monitoring force, and it can't be a bad thing, it must be drawn from non-NATO members. So again, I'm always bemused when NATO, the leading NATO nations, the coalition of the willing, are actually talking about having NATO troops deployed as part of a monitoring force when the Russians have been adamant against it. I think that something with China, with Russia, with China, with India, some African nations, who knows what that might look like. And then I think that is plausible, and I suspect that the Russians would be open-minded to that, but I think they'll be closed-minded to anything which has NATO in it, because of course, in Russians' minds, I happen to agree with them strategically, the whole of the war is to do with the expansion of NATO. So anything which has NATO either explicitly or implicitly in the force seems to me to be something which they're probably going to say no to. And because they're in the driving seat, then if they say no to it, then it won't happen.
Yeah, I agree, and I also think there's a much bigger question here. I mean, any sort of deal for a ceasefire armistice for Ukraine won't necessarily represent an enduring peace. I mean, I think so long as any sort of deal, any security provisions are essentially between European states and NATO, that effectively European states, NATO, and Ukraine, that effectively gives Ukraine a veto over the process, as it had after the Minsk II agreement, where it had a veto over the lifting of sanctions against Russia. We won't get into the detail of the Minsk II again. I think I covered that before. But I mean, it strikes me that actually for an enduring peace, that there needs to be some sort of bigger deal with the Russians in terms of the lifting of economic restrictions and the normalization of or the gradual normalization of social and economic relations, with Russia. Otherwise, I fear a ceasefire will just be, particularly if Zelensky gets his wish of an 800,000 army, although he can't afford that and the Europeans can't afford that either. That would just be pressing the pause button, for the next war against Russia.
I think you're right, Ian. I think it's in Europe's interest and Ukraine's interest to do what the Russians have asked us to do in the very first place, which was to establish mechanisms and processes that actually address what are seen as the causes of the conflict, and in a way which is sustainable over the long term. And NATO doesn't seem to me to have a part in that, because in Russians' minds, and in the minds as well of a lot of very intelligent and clever historical Western figures and recent Western figures, NATO's the problem as opposed to the solution. I think the solutions are elsewhere. You did a very interesting podcast recently on this issue. I've been wondering for some time whether the OSCE has a role in this. The great advantage, of course, of the OSCE is that Russia is part of it, and the clue to its mandate is in the word cooperation. But what I think we've got to avoid, and I've said this before, but what we've got to avoid is talking on the West about deterring Russia. It's about deterrence is what we talk about, but what that always means is confrontation. So I think we've got to move past confrontation and start to work out how we cooperate with the Russians and start to talk to each other again. I'm not saying that's going to be an easy conversation. It's going to be extremely difficult. We almost need something like the Congress of Vienna, where actually we can all be sitting down in difficult conversations. But the ultimate aim, I think, is probably summed up in Gorbachev's phrase, our common European home, and working out how we can return from this state of war to one where we do begin to talk to each other and indeed trade with each other. And I have to say that the trade is actually important. And I speak now as an energy person, because having cut ourselves off in what I call boomerang sanctions from Russian oil and gas, the European industry, particularly German industry, is struggling. And that's an entirely foreseeable situation. So the idea that you can impose these sanctions without impact upon yourselves, I just can't see how people could have thought about it in the first place. To me, it's economic. You'll hear Michael Every talk about economic statecraft and the use of economic levers to actually achieve geopolitical results. And we seem to have done this in the most cack-handed and almost suicidal way in Europe, accepting and imposing sanctions on Russia, which seem to have had no effect on the Russian economy, but a boomerang effect, which is not yet catastrophic, but it's certainly deeply damaging to Western economies. Russia is was the largest producer of diesel for Europe. Of course, it also was the largest producer of fertilizer as well. So, don't let's be surprised if we see food prices go up when the price of diesel and the price of fertilizer is going up. Duh.
Yeah, I read a fascinating seminar paper from the Foreign Office from 14 years ago, actually, about the Helsinki conference of 1973 to 1975, to go back to your kind of a comment about the Congress of Vienna. And it was fascinating that actually the British, or at least the principal private secretary to the foreign secretary at the time, said of the process that actually it was a continuation of the Cold War by other more subtle means. And I think what he meant by that was the British and actually also the Americans at the time, saw the Helsinki process as a way to kind of open up and re-engage with the Soviets so as to reform them through kind of people-to-people exchange and that sort of thing. Whereas the Soviets very much saw it through the lens of actually trying to have put in place the inviolability of borders, obviously within the Warsaw Pact and within the Soviet Union, itself. And what's missing then, and why that document is sort of fading into the past, really, is the issue of trust. And of course, that doesn't exist now. It will take a generation, to rebuild it. But I mean, the Russians are never going to engage with the process unless they see that there's genuine sincerity around, re-engagement, with the Europeans, because they will be worried about sort of getting backed into another kind of Helsinki type situation again, I suspect.
Yeah, I've got an article in draft, Ian, which I've haven't quite finished, but it's about Europe's choices. And essentially, what I'm saying in the article is that the choice is a very simple one. It's either double down and hope, which is what we're trying to do at the moment with what appears to be little effect. What I opened the article by saying that I quote Schopenhauer, who says that truth has three stages. The first is it's ridiculed. The second is it's violently opposed, and the third is that it's taken as self-evident. Now, I think the victory, the Russian victory, which is perhaps within a year, has we're past violent ridicule, or we're past ridicule with the Europeans, and now they're into violent opposition, from what I can see. As tacitly, the Americans, I think, see that the Russian victory is self-evident, and they're shifting their focus. What I said is that we've got the opportunity to either double down and hope as Europeans, or much better is to start to think about a plan B. I think the plan B would have three key elements of it. The first is the diplomatic element, which is to start talking to the Russians. And I think those conversations ought to happen at the very highest levels. So I think that I'm not saying that those will be easy conversations, happening at the very highest levels with the right preparations, of course. I think that the military discussion should be thinking very carefully about what the post-war arrangements look like. And this is where we come into the sorts of things you were talking about in your podcast, and the use, for example, of the OSCE. And I think there are significant questions in Europe about NATO and the future of NATO. I think NATO is past its sell-by date. I'm fed up of hearing people say it's the strongest alliance ever. It obviously isn't, because it couldn't beat the Taliban. And the only success that you could nominally say it had was in Kosovo, and that was undertaken under very dubious international legal a legal regime, if you like. And I would say that we were less, from an international law point of view, we were less legitimate in our intervention in Kosovo than the Russians were in Ukraine. But the third element, I think, is the economic element. And I think what the Europeans could do here would be to remove all sanctions unilaterally, and as a gesture of starting, or at least a program of reducing the sanctions. Not least of all, because it would be on our own economic interest to do so. So we've actually started to relieve some of the pressures that we've put upon ourselves, and mean that we're less dependent on, for example, LNG, expensive LNG from the United States and Qatar. And we have, again, start to have access to some of those cheaper fuels that come from Russia. But whether or not we go that way is an open question. I suspect we're going to do more double down and hope until finally the truth arrives, and people can no longer avoid the evidence of a Russian victory. So let's see where that goes. I'd love to think that Europeans would start to change in that way. I don't see any sign of it, but eventually they will have to confront the fact that NATO and Ukraine have been defeated.
Yeah, I likened it in an article that I wrote last year to the grief cycle. Where I mean, from the starting point that actually Ukraine, has lost. Their hopes have been killed of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. That they've been through shock, then they went through denial, then they've been through kind of bargaining, where they're hoping that it really isn't true, and they're just approaching the point of depression, before they reach the point of acceptance that it really is dead. But it doesn't seem to be that we're quite there. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, I agree with you. Actually, I think they should lift all other kind of economic sanctions. If not immediately, then certainly over a very quick kind of phased, process. I mean, certainly, the Europeans don't want to do that, because they're clinging on to these immobilized Russian assets to kind of, at some point in the future, kind of backstop the loan, or underwrite the loans they're providing to Ukraine to kind of fund the war effort, right? So, I don't see anyone in Europe who's going to break that deadlock.
Yeah.
And agree. I mean, even if the Americans do, and I suspect they probably would, because that they want to have an economic reset with Russia, because they're much more clear-sighted, on this. I see nothing. I see nothing in Europe that suggests to me that even if there is a ceasefire, that the likes of von der Leyen and Callas are going to say, well, actually, therefore we lift sanctions. They're quite the opposite. I think they will, as you say, kind of double down and say, well, we need to, we won't lift these until Russia pays reparations, and Russia isn't going to pay reparations because it kind of came out, even if you call it a score draw, I mean, they came out strategically on top.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think the chances of the Russians paying reparations are very low indeed. It wouldn't surprise me if the Russians, in fact, I would bet that they will actually be investing in the areas of the Donbass and the areas of what may eventually become Novorossiya, where they hold those territories and investing in rebuilding. When it comes to the rebuilding the rest of Ukraine, then I would think the Russians would want to make no contribution unless and until the NATO members were involved in that as well. It's a very worrying thing as well because there's a long rebuilding program to be done as far as I can see in the energy infrastructure, which will take time and a lot of money. It's money, as you say, that we don't have, and the money that we do have, money that we do want to loan into existence, is actually being used for destructive purposes as opposed to constructive purposes. So I think the Europeans, I think you're right, I don't see much sign of it. You see a little bit of it in Orban. You do see a lot of it in Orban. You're starting to see Metz's position changing a little bit as he starts to talk about talking to Russia. So there may be the early signs of it, but at the moment, it is a concern that the defeat which so many of us in the alternative media, both on this side of the Atlantic and on the others with those podcasters who you and I know so well, seems to be so clear. And yet, because of the political narrative that's been spun and is being adhered to by the Europeans, there's very little sign of the European politicians wanting to change. And sadly, because the country has been so propagandized by this narrative, there's few in the country who actually realize the perilousness of Ukraine's situation. I feel for the Ukrainians. I think they've been let down by their politicians, but I also think they've been let down by the Western politicians, particularly those who as the war kicked off, prevented the Istanbul process concluding. Because imagine how things would be if the process had concluded. Ukraine would have had a much better deal than is ever possible now. But that deal has stopped because the Americans and the British were intent on defeating Russia. With no real strategic thought as far as I can see. I can see no sense of any strategy that would have made this possible. And indeed, I don't really see any sense of much strategy at all. So, it's a very sad place that we arrive in. It's a place that some of us, starting with John Mearsheimer, have predicted for some time. And it's a very sad place that we've arrived in. And it's even sadder in a way that we're throwing good money after bad now, and notwithstanding the evidence on the battlefield.
Yeah. Well, one final question, so I know you need to kind of rush off. I know we can talk a bit about the OSCE. Do you think that can ever develop itself as a replacement for NATO? I mean, my fear with NATO is that it's a bit like it's a giant UN peacekeeping operation, easy to set up, harder to take apart. I mean, do you think OSCE is a kind of credible route in the future to provide for pan European Eurasian security?
I think it's a much more credible route than NATO. People don't realize that until you actually operate in NATO, this great assumption that it's the strongest alliance in history. The strongest alliance in history was the alliance in the Second World War between the Americans, the Commonwealth, Britain and the Commonwealth, Russia, China, and those out in the Far East. That was a strong alliance in history by some distance. NATO was strong during the Cold War, But really, our defence spending reduced so much since the Cold War. From I think it was about 6% we were spending at the end of the Cold War, down to about 2.5%, and with the possibility of getting to 3% by 2030 and 3.5% by 2035. The naval forces in which I was part of, we've got a third of the ships. But also it's the lack of training capabilities and the lack of experience. But within the NATO HQ, it's a difficult place to work. It's difficult because all of the nations have a sort of, not once sort of veto is too strong, but the NATO nations always refer decisions back to their capitals and they come back into NATO to actually arrive at final final decisions. I saw it firsthand in NATO and in Afghanistan, as you did. And NATO was it was a NATO operation from 2007. NATO took over about halfway through my tour out there, and there was no strategy, and it was very interesting to see how the countries operated in different ways. So there's no unification within NATO as a fighting force. There are lots of procedures and processes that are similar, but as a fighting force, it was very ununified, I thought. I felt for the Canadians who got a hammering in Kandahar. Now as indeed did we in Helmand. But I felt for the Canadians, and eventually political pressure caused them to remove themselves from the operation. I mean, the operation was ill-conceived in the first place, but that's not the point. The point is that NATO is not the unified thing that people think. And often you'll go into a headquarters and it feels bloated, frankly. And it's partly bloated because there is a sense that we need to actually provide a position for everybody who's part of the alliance. And so you've got officers with different nations and different cap badges sort of operating together and with very different sets of capabilities as well. So NATO, I think, in terms of unity and your common European home, I think it's got little capability. I said in an article some time ago that NATO exists to confront a threat created by its own existence, but does not have the capability to confront the threat that its own existence creates. So the sooner that we pass it off, the better. And I think OSCE may not have the same reputation as NATO, but it's about cooperation and security, and that to me is the way to think about it, not in terms of deterrence and confrontation, which is what NATO has always been about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And as I often say, you can't win a war by committee,
Mm.
unfortunately, which it sums up what happened in Afghanistan and also has been happening in Ukraine since the war started. Steve, thanks very much for joining me again today. We should try and make a regular gig of this, talk about kind of the week's events from a political, military, and strategic perspective. But for now, Steve Jermy, thanks so much, and thank you, everybody, for watching as always and supporting my work. Tomorrow is my 1 month anniversary since I started, and I've been amazed, frankly, by the support I've had so far. Almost 6,800 subscribers already. Thank you all so much. Please continue to like and subscribe to these videos. Wherever you are in the world, I wish you very much peace. And Steve, again, thanks so much for joining us. Hope to see you again soon.
My pleasure, Ian. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.